This afternoon, our speaker today is Norma Noonan, chairman of the Political Science Department at Augsburg College. Her subject will be Soviet intentions in the 1970s. Here is Professor Norma Noonan.
What I would like to do this morning is to present an overview of contemporary Soviet society and suggest to you some options for the future. And as Mr. Devitt has said, I'm calling it on the threshold of change, which I believe the Soviet Union is. In this way, we shall be pointing out some areas to watch for the 70s, and I'll let you then do the predictions on the basis of watching and some developments you can look for. Some crystal balling is, of course, involved, but I hope within a framework of the present situation. At the same time, my survey of the present Soviet Union of necessity will be only a sketch, and perhaps will raise as many questions as it will answer. So, if you have any questions afterwards, feel free. Let me suggest to you as an introduction some background hypotheses. In an essay written last year, Andrei Amalrik, a young Soviet intellectual, I say young because he and I are about the same age, also looked at the contemporary Soviet Union, and on the basis of his analysis, predicted that the Soviet regime would collapse sometime between 1980 and 1985. His was a pessimistic view. On the other hand, one finds analysts who are constantly seeking evidence of dramatic breakthrough and change in Soviet society, and who predict democratization at every change. Now, I see these as contradictory and extreme alternatives of what is likely to happen in the Soviet Union. And keeping these two extremes in the background, I shall try to analyze the present system and then to do some crystal balling about it. The Soviet Union in October 1970 is a puzzling society and a puzzling political system. At 53 years, it is chronologically a mature political system, one of the oldest in the contemporary world, really. When you consider all the political systems in the world, the Soviet Union is one of the oldest, though it often speaks of itself as one of the youngest. And yet, in many ways, the Soviet Union, after 53 years, is an adolescence. It is not the type totalitarian society of the Stalin era, a society of austerity, fear, and widespread repression. Nor is it a society which has lived up to the expectations promised in the post-Stalin reforms, political, social, economic, and intellectual. The early post-Stalin period brought forth many hopes of a liberalization and democratization, but these have not been fully realized. The leadership today is less autocratic than under Stalin, but the reins of power are tightly held by the Politburo of the party headed by Brezhnev, Kosygin, and Podgorny. Their power is shared with the Council of Ministers within the government apparatus and by the Central Committee in the party apparatus. More than Stalin's power was shared. But these elite groups are not about to renounce their influence and that of the party in favor of a true working-class democracy or some other ideal system. The Soviet Union was a dictatorship under Stalin and an oligarchy at present, an elite rule. It is, moreover, a technocratic oligarchy. There are many engineers in the positions of prominence. For example, Brezhnev has a degree as an engineer. Kosygin's education was also that of an engineer. Podgorny was that of an engineer, and so are many of the other people at the top. Also, these oligarchs are men whose careers were shaped in the 1930s and 1940s under Stalin. And they could not but be influenced by that experience. In the 1930s, when the purges were going on in the Soviet Union, these were the young men who rose up, replacing those who were purged. This meant they went along with Stalin. For example, Kosygin rose up in Leningrad during the purges, and by the late 30s was the mayor of Leningrad. Internationally, the Soviet Union in 1970 is more a part of the international system of nations than it was in 1953. In 1953, when Stalin died, the Soviet Union was a comparatively isolated power, whose only ties were, or major ties were among the other Communist Party states. Today, the Soviet Union has extensive contacts among the underdeveloped states and growing contacts among the Western states, as Mr. Zebit's introduction indicated. It is a more positive participant in the UN than it was in the early 50s, when the Soviet Niet was frequently voiced in the Security Council. And I think many of you can remember in the late 40s and early 50s when UN Security Council sessions and General Assembly sessions were on TV, Andrei Gromyko's Niet coming across very frequently. Yet internationally today, the Soviet Union still occupies a somewhat dual position. As both one of the two great powers in whatever way power is counted, and as leader of the international communist movement, which has purported in its ideology, written some time ago, to want world communist revolution. And this dualism often causes conflict. For the Soviet Union, as an influential great power in 1970, has much to like in the current status quo, and might lose a great deal in any radical change. The Soviet Union has as much to lose as any of the Western powers in a radical world revolution. Moving to consideration of present Soviet society internally, one also finds much that is intriguing. The intellectual atmosphere of Soviet society has improved somewhat over that of the oppressive Stalin years. There is greater variety in the theater and in music. Yet the writers tend still to be either the servants of the system or its martyrs. In the early post-Stalin years, there was an intellectual thought in literature and the arts, with some intermittent breathing. But somehow the intellectual climate of the USSR never fully defrosted. Indeed, the last 5-6 years have been marked by so prolonged a freeze in intellectual life that some analysts are inclined to call it a return to Stalinism. I have been more cautious, as some of you who have heard me before know, in making such an assessment, because I don't think the label is fully justified. Yet at the same time, I must note that most of what is published today in the official Soviet press, the novels, literature, and so on, is dry and sterile, rehashing old themes. If you look at the plan of publication in 1970, which I did, most of the novels are about the Russian Revolution of 1917, or about World War II, or fictionized accounts of the life of Lenin. Hardly new themes in Soviet literature. The exciting materials, the ones with the interesting ideas, are those which are being circulated in typewritten form from hand to hand, a phenomenon becoming so well known that it has been called sam izdat, which means self-published. Most of these works have been smuggled out of the USSR and are known to us, such as Amalric's Will the Soviet Union Survive Until 1984, or Solzhenitsyn's The First Circle, or Solzhenitsyn's play, which is at the Guthrie, or Sakharov's Progress, Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom, and so on and so forth. Also, the last 5 years have been marked by selective arrests of intellectuals, not on the scale of the Stalin era, but still an alarming phenomenon. Julie Daniel, the writer, was freed recently after 5 years of imprisonment, but Andrei Amalric was reportedly arrested. And so one cannot be really optimistic about the general significance of the liberation of Daniel as a signal for a new intellectual thought. In respect to other domestic issues, such as the standard of living and consumer goods, the Soviet Union similarly has not lived up to post-Stalin expectations. The Stalin years were austere. Even in the early 1950s, after post-war recovery, the Soviet Union suffered a lot in the war and had really to start from a very low level to recover. Consumer goods were in short supply in the Stalin years. The assortment of food was limited. Starches were a mainstay of one's diet. Clothing was very expensive, poor quality, with very little variety and choice. A man with 2 suits was considered affluent, and a woman with a print dress, however unattractive that print, was to be envied. Apartment space was inadequate, and often a family was forced to share a 2-room apartment with another family. Any semi-luxury consumer goods were in very short supply, even plates, pots and pans, utensils, as well as cars, refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and so on. Since most people had very little money after paying for their food and clothing, perhaps whether refrigerators were available was an irrelevant question. Real wages in the Stalin period were low. In these areas, there has unquestionably been great improvement in the last 17 years. But it has not met the demands of the Soviet people, which are modest by our standards. Many apartments have gone up in the past 17 years, and they are providing adequate shelter for people, despite the many stories about the falling bricks and all of that, which actually are true, but even so, the apartments are adequate. More and more people now have an apartment per family, usually 2 rooms, and usually also with private kitchen and bath facilities. While the architectural style of the apartment dwellings is monotonous, I think there are 4 basic plans for the whole country. The Soviet planners have made rapid strides toward providing everybody with minimal, adequate housing. More apartments are needed, but the progress has been great. In consumer goods such as clothing and household items, progress has also been noticeable over the past 17 years. People are better dressed and have more to choose from when buying clothes or making clothes. The drab, austere look of the Stalin era has left, except among the elderly and the rural population. In respect to the general appearance of the populace, I noticed a marked difference even between my 1963-64 stay and my recent 1969 stay. The urban dwellers are better and more stylishly dressed. It's not Paris, but it sure is a heck of a lot better than under Stalin. But clothing still remains frightfully expensive for the Russian. A good pair of women's shoes is about $50, and average wages are between $100 and $120 a month, you say. A man's suit, you figure about $110. He's got, a month's salary is the worker's salary. A sweater, average sweater, $30 to $50. Moreover, people want more variety in the clothing that is available and more quantity at lower prices. This is what they were promised. One specialty item in particularly that they are clamoring for is fur. To a Russian, whether male or female, fur is not regarded as a luxury but as a necessity, partly because of the weather, but partly because of sort of a natural love for fur. To buy a fur hat or a fur collar, a man or a woman would be willing to go on a bread and water diet for an indefinite period of time, or, not eat lunches or something like this. But also, except for karakul, which is what we call Persian lamb, and some fox, has been withdrawn from the internal domestic market and has been siphoned into the more lucrative export market and the foreign currency market. And the Russians have a number of gripes about this. Appliances and other consumer goods still do not meet demand. In particular, the demand for automobiles is one of the most burning. Cars are expensive, about $4,000 to $5,000 for the cheapest compact, and one must pay cash on the line. No credit, no 3-year extended payments, and all that. Yet there are reasonably long waiting lists for cars. The new Fiat plant built in Tolyatti in southern Russia will alleviate part of this problem by providing about 200,000 more cars a year. Now you're probably asking, but who can afford cars? Well, the professional class can. The middle class, as I shall call them later. Especially where both husband and wife have professions. And remember, in the Soviet Union, the 2-income family is the rule rather than the exception. In the consumer goods area generally then, the Soviet Union has come quite a long way, but not far enough as far as the Russians are concerned, especially not in household appliances like refrigerators or washing machines and so on. Another significant area is that of agriculture and agricultural production. Agriculture has been one of the most disappointing areas of the whole post-Stalin era. In the years before 1953, it was probably the most serious economic problem. 17 years later, it remains that. People have enough to eat in terms of quantity. No one is denying that. Indeed, most people in the USSR would be overweight by American insurance company standards. If you ever want to feel skinny, I would suggest a trip to Russia. Because everybody weighs 15, 20 pounds more than you do and still considered normal. The problem is not in the quantity, but in the quality of the diet. Starchy foods such as bread, even though it is a bread rich in nutrients, play a big role in the diet. Fruits are expensive, and vegetables are limited, especially in the winter. By the time you get to about January or February, cabbage and potatoes are about the only thing you find in the government stores. If you go into the peasant market, which exists in some of the cities, you can find onions and carrots. But in the summer you have a lot of vegetables, but not in the winter. The winter diet gets to be pretty monotonous. You better like cabbage or you're in trouble. Meat is consumed in small quantities, and in recent years has been scarcer. Indeed, there was more meat in the stores when I was there in 63 than in 69. Lamb has almost disappeared, for example, and this is very popular meat in the Soviet Union, partly because the people in the Caucasus ate a lot of lamb, and partly because the death of a number of sheep herds in the mountains. One story we heard in 69 was that meat was being sent to the Soviet troops in Czechoslovakia, and this accounted for the shortages. But I think, how much meat could the Soviet soldiers in Czechoslovakia be eating if there would be a significant shortage? I found that this was not the whole story, personally. Also, a problem in agriculture is the distribution of existing supplies. Theoretically, there is national distribution. In actual fact, given the enormous distances, and remember the Soviet Union is almost 3 times as large as the United States in terms of size, and given the structure and the operation of the republics, which are dominated, say, by rather rival groups, national distribution is hard to achieve. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Ukraine is known for its fruits and its vegetables. It's a very fertile area. It's the black soil area, somewhat like Minnesota. Every day when I was in Kiev last fall, I had for lunch about an 8-ounce glass of fruit juice, part of my lunch. And this would vary. Some days it would be peach or apple or pear or plum, really a variety of things. And I had this at the hotel, which was, by Soviet standards, rather expensive. And I was able to have this every day for lunch for about 11 cents an 8-ounce glass. This is a pretty good price. On the other hand, right after Kiev, I flew to Leningrad. In Leningrad, I found there was almost no fruit juice on the menu or for sale in the stores anywhere, yet Leningrad is one of the 2 largest cities. By contrast, domestic paper products such as napkins and other household paper products were very hard to find in Kiev. I really had to scour the stores. I never did find paper napkins in Kiev while I was there. They were always out. Whereas they were readily available all over in Leningrad. Problems of national supply. Another problem contributing to the shortages domestically is that food, especially in cans and jars, is exported, either to underdeveloped countries or various other countries for foreign currency. At the Ukrainian Permanent Exhibition, for example, one can see jars and jars and jars and jars of gorgeous preserved fruits and vegetables, preserved tomatoes, preserved pickles, gorgeous things. But you almost never see these for sale in the stores. On the other hand, if you were to read the Soviet international journal Foreign Trade, which is published for distribution around the world, there it boasts of the availability for export of these very same jars of fruit and vegetables. A similar situation prevails, for example, in canned fish. I have seen people in the Soviet Union lined up for 1 and 2 hours when canned salmon goes on sale. How many of you would line up for 5 minutes for canned salmon? Yet this and other fish is exported. Soviet crab meat, for example, is almost non-existent in the internal market, yet well known elsewhere. Caviar, perhaps the best-known Russian luxury food, has also disappeared from the domestic market, except for May Day, November 7th, and New Year's, the national holidays. At other times, the only way a Russian can enjoy a portion of caviar is if he is one of the few who can afford to go to a first-class restaurant where for about $2 a portion he can have a serving of caviar as an appetizer, and it's a pretty small serving like that. Yet I might note in passing that in the summer, tourists from the West are lavishly served caviar even on the cheaper tours as if it were a staple that was overflowing. In general, agriculture is one of the most serious problems today. Last winter, when I was there, I heard on Soviet national TV speeches by both Brezhnev and another high-ranking official, Polyansky, to the Third Congress of Collective Farmers. The message was clear. Something has to be done about agriculture. Young people have to be encouraged to go back to the farm. The last thing Soviet young people want to do today is to go back to the farm. They want jobs in the cities. They want to get away from the rural areas. And this is a serious problem. Therefore, Brezhnev urged that a national campaign be mounted to tell people about how great life on the farm can be. And I saw several movies, for example, about the glories of life on the farm in contrast to the city and so on. Productivity on the Soviet farms is very low. A collective farm with 250 people might produce the same amount and might be the same size as a Minnesota farm that would be operated by one man with one helper. Khrushchev was eventually defeated in large part because of the failure of his agriculture policies. Today, agriculture is proving a serious weakness for the present government of Brezhnev and Kosygin. Overall, in the last 17 years, the Soviet people have made considerable strides in their standard of living. Their real wages are higher. They live in better housing. They are better clothed and have more consumer goods. But on the debit side, real wages have not grown as much as hoped for or promised, because some items have become more expensive, including food. Food has not become cheaper, it's become more expensive. And also because the prices of some items, which were set very high in the 40s and 50s, have not been reduced as promised, such as clothing, TV, and appliances. To give you an idea, a black and white TV with a little wooden console would probably cost about $600. It's about a 17-inch TV. The comparable model here with a little wooden cabinet would cost about $200. Also, consumer goods have not increased in supply as rapidly as promised. On the non-material side, moving away from standard of living, consumer goods, the Soviet citizen today no longer lives with the fear which he knew under Stalin. One is not afraid to grumble or criticize the economic system. And a lot of these complaints about what's happening in the economic system, you can hear if you walk down the street, if you understand Russian. People will grumble to you in stores. I had people, total strangers, come up to me and complain. They thought I was Russian. They didn't think I was a foreigner. And even some aspects of the political system one would criticize among one's friends today. The secret police are presumably not listening to every word anymore. While a number of intellectuals have been arrested in recent years, this phenomenon seems removed from the life of the average man. The average man is more interested in the price of goods and services and whether his kid is going to go to college and in the prospect of someday buying a car than he is in abstract questions about the system, such as those that are bothering Sakharov or Amalrik. However, also removed from the life of the average man is a sense of identity with his political regime. He has no say in the selection or the removal of a Kosygin, a Podgorny, or a Brezhnev. He elects the Supreme Soviet, the equivalent of a national legislature, and he elects the local Soviets, the equivalent of city councils. But in these elections, only one candidate runs. And so this is a rather empty power. In the local elections to the town councils or Soviets, about one candidate in 8,800 is defeated. In other words, you have a choice of yes or no, and one candidate in 8,800 is defeated. This shows that it's possible to lose, but that it doesn't happen very often. The reason why these candidates are defeated, moreover, is normally connected to a local grievance, like faulty plumbing in a particular neighborhood, more than to major issues of principle. For the average Russian today, the political leadership are they, as opposed to we, much as the leaders were in the pre-revolutionary period. I find, for example, that people in Russia are very interested in Western elections, especially American elections, however much propaganda they've been fed on the meaninglessness of our party system. You know, Khrushchev had this joke that the difference between the Republican and Democratic Party you couldn't see on the head of the pin, and, you know, everybody knows that kind of stuff. But despite that, they're fascinated, because I think they are fascinated by the element of choice, by the element of knowing the candidates ahead of time. This is something they never know. Brezhnev could resign today and another man be in tomorrow, and this would not affect the life of the individual man. He wouldn't know about it. They probably would not admit that they're fascinated by the choice, but this seems to me to be the case, and I find Russians identify with many of our candidates. In particular, they're very fond of the memory of John Kennedy, and there's a really strong cult of John Kennedy in the Soviet Union. To summarize this, I would say the Soviet citizen is both involved in its system, yet separated from it. Involved in the sense that the successful functioning of the system affects his daily life. The successful fulfillment of the economic plan each year is not a theoretical question that you read about in Providence, but one which deeply affects him as a citizen and consumer. It affects what his kids are going to eat the next month or year. On the other hand, the fact that he has no say in determining the leadership elite makes him feel remote, detached, and even alienated from his system. But perhaps the basic question to ask about the Soviet Union today is how fast they are moving toward their own goals, namely the goal of building communism. By which I mean the goal of building what they call the fully communist society, a classless society, the utopian society predicted by Karl Marx. In Marxist-Leninist thinking, and then in recent Soviet ideology, there has been an increasingly elaborate set of stages to follow after the proletarian revolution occurs. One casually in the West refers to the Soviet Union as a communist society. They do not. They refer to themselves as a socialist society, which is a reflection of the stage that they are now in. Marx thought that revolution would occur, and that after the revolution there would be two stages: the dictatorship of the proletariat, sometimes he called it crude communism. This would be a short transitional period, and then one would go into full communism, the utopian higher stage. The Soviet Union has made this series of stages much more complex. The first years after the revolution were called the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional period in which vestiges of the old society were removed, in which power was passed to the working class and facts passed to the party, in which the means of production passed from private to state hands, and in which the property of the old classes was expropriated. In 1936, Stalin announced that the first stage was over, that they had reached stage 2, socialism. Socialism was to be an intermediate stage. Classes would exist, but they would no longer be hostile classes, they would be friendly classes. And the three classes that he defined were the workers and the peasants, and then a subgroup or stratum, the intelligentsia, which is loosely anybody who isn't a worker or a peasant, basically white-collar workers. The class struggle, said Stalin, was over in Russia. Now, there would be in this stage differentials in wages and so on, based on ability, the amount of work, and so on. And this stage would have the task of building a society toward the utopian goal of communism. In the late 50s, the leadership under Khrushchev again evaluated their progress. It was then announced retroactively that in 1936, the Soviet Union had reached only the first stage of socialism, and that only in the 50s had the Soviet Union come to the stage of full socialism. So they added another stage. Now, they said it was time to think of concrete plans for building communism. The leadership drew up a 20-year plan, 1960 to 1980, for building what were called the material technical bases of communism, or the first stage of communism. And then after 1980, one would make a transition to full communism, though full communism per se could only be achieved when all of the socialist countries reached the same stage of development, something that is often predicted to be the end of the 21st century. Communism per se was defined as follows. Quote, communism is a classless social system with one public property for the means of production, full social equality of all members of society, where together with all-rounded development of people will grow also the productive forces on the basis of constantly growing science and technology. All sources of social wealth will be poured on at full torrent, and there will be realized the great principle from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. Communism is a highly organized society of free and conscious toilers in which is a firm social self-government, works for the good of society, will become for all the first vital necessity, a realized necessity. The talents of each will be employed with greater benefit for the whole people, end quote. Now, what were the targets precisely to get to this? What were the targets for building the material technical basis of communism? First, a very high level of technological development, which in the Khrushchev period was defined as passing the United States in every major area of industrial production. Khrushchev very much saw the future in terms of passing the United States. Since he's left, they sort of dropped this criterion overtly, but still there tacitly. Second criterion would be the extension of existing services and benefits, such as to have completely free public transportation, to have completely free lunches all over, to have shorter working days, and so on and so forth. Transition in governmental institutions, more power passing to so-called public bodies, more public participation in governance, more popular control over state organs, a preparatory stage to the long, long-range withering away of the state predicted by Engels. A fourth goal was the reducing the differences between town and country, urban and rural, which in the Soviet Union are very pronounced. And also removing the differences between mental and physical labor, between the white and blue-collar workers. Moving more and more toward the classless society, so the full classless society would come only under the farther goal of full communism. Now, where are they at the halfway point of building the material technical basis? For indeed, 1970 is the halfway point. First of all, after Khrushchev departed in 1964, the 1980 date was mentioned less and less. Although the 20-year total plan is still the governing program of the party, that has not been changed. The production targets have not met expectations in the last 10 years, probably in large part because they were they were reaching too high, basically. And where they have caught up and passed the United States are in industries which the Soviet scientist Sakharov has called areas of obsolete technology. They are very, very far behind in the newer industries, chemicals, plastics, and so on. The significant economic reforms of 1965, moreover, have not produced the economic development, the rapid growth that was hoped for, so they feel they are in trouble. The differences between town and rural area remain, and even seem sharper as the urban area becomes more sophisticated and mature. The kolkhoznik, or peasant farmer, who comes into the city in his dusty, well-worn clothes, in his dirty boots, and his old quilted navy blue coat, is stunned by the relative affluence of the city. And I have sometimes walked behind some of these people, and all of a sudden they just stop and look around in wonder. And in particular in the big department stores, they'll just stop short all of a sudden, and you're caught behind them, practically bumping into them if you're walking behind them too close. And they just can't believe the difference between their way of life in the country and the way of life of the city. Also, I think that rather than the class structure becoming less pronounced, I think it is becoming more pronounced. And urban and small town middle class has become entrenched. In part, it is a result of wage differentials, but not entirely so, since under the new incentive plans put in since 1965, many manual workers are now earning more than teachers and other professionals. It's always easy to pass the teachers in any case. The answer lies first, I think, in the sense that one feels that one is part of the educated class, the urban class, the bureaucratic class, part of the intelligentsia or the white-collar class. And therefore, there is, I think, a feeling that one is better than the average worker. This is, I think, the kind of mentality that is operating. The sense of being part of the intellectual class, a certainly very broadly defined one, is strong. In addition, those who are in established professions have a sense of being solid citizens, entitled to rewards for their contributions to society. And they expect financial remuneration to reflect their contribution. They want a nice apartment, a car, a college education for their kids, and so on. They expect wage differentials to continue. The prospect of the new middle classes giving up voluntarily their status is dubious. It is a status which is a psychological, social, and financial one. The middle class, for example, tends to save up its money and to invest in cooperative apartments, often with a group of friends. And so in a sense you are creating ghettos of like income and like-minded people because you get together and you go out to a suburb, and when the building materials are available, you build cooperative apartments, and your neighbors are people that you know or friends of friends and so on. The middle class wants to travel. They want college educations for their children. They want vacations in nice Soviet resorts. They want cars. They don't particularly want to move toward a classless society, which might erase much of what they have gained. For example, southwest Moscow, with its new apartments and broad streets and trees, is a very prestigious suburb. This is where the astronauts live. This is also where some of the political leaders live in their weekend houses. Many professional people live there. And I can recall last year meeting an interesting clerk, a very intelligent woman, whose two unmarried sons were both well-educated and had established jobs, telling me that their family had recently moved to an apartment in this suburb in southwest Moscow. And she told me proudly that they had moved to a quote-unquote aristocratic neighborhood. Karl Marx must have been turning over in his grave at that moment. Now, I'm sure she would not want its profile to change and to put in there people who were less aristocratic, so to speak. The Soviet Union, in brief, I do not think is moving toward a classless society. And indeed, it seems to me the class differences are more and more entrenched. In the past 10 years, there has been no perceptible change in the nature of governance. Some public organs are involved in local matters, but by and large, the governing institutions of the state and the party remain the same. I don't see them moving very fast towards this goal of a program. I might note that the long-range withering away of the state will in no case affect the Communist Party, since the Communist Party is officially defined as a public organization, which puts it in the same category of the women's clubs and the stamp collectors clubs, and it's not officially a state organization. This is a particular technical difference that they wish to define. It really makes no difference because the party determines what the state decides anyway. In terms of building the material technical bases of communism, the Soviet Union has made progress in technical and industrial sphere in the past 10 years since 1960, but less so in the social sphere. The transition, despite intense educational effort, has not taken root in the minds of men. Why then, given all of this, do I posit that the Soviet Union today is on the threshold of change? A variety of reasons. First, its leaders are old. At 63, Brezhnev is the baby among the three top leaders, and he allegedly is ailing. In general, the Politburo, the top 11 men in the country, is filled with men who are nearing retirement age, men of 65, 66, 67, 68, 69. Second, the economic problems of the past year are serious. I would compare them to the economic problems in the year before Khrushchev left power. And I think that if they continue thus, some changes will come, either of the leadership or of the economy or both. This particular team of Brezhnev and Kosygin came to power on a program of economic reform and economic development. They've had 6 years, and they haven't delivered significantly. There's been improvement, yes, but not as much as they wanted. Third reason, freedom of expression is today at a halfway house. Some kinds of criticism are permitted, such as grumbling and criticizing the system among your friends and so on, whereas others, especially the creative efforts of writers, are not permitted. Some change here seems inevitable, one way or the other. There will either be a consistent loosening or a consistent tightening, but I don't think you're going to keep this halfway house. Fourth reason, the 20-year plan or development program is not working as anticipated. Therefore, they will either modify the program, something that's happened in the past with other programs, or they will try to bring about changes in the society to more nearly pursue it. 5, because the new middle class is more and more conscious of its existence and of its status, and they wish to continue it. Moreover, they are in positions of control. Brezhnev and Kosygin, among others, are in the new middle class. And they will try, I think, consciously or unconsciously, to prevent efforts toward a really classless society. However much they will piously voice egalitarian precepts. Moreover, the Soviet Union at 53 is middle-aged. And when you are middle-aged, you are conscious of respectability. In the past 17 years, it has done much to repair its early disreputable international image. And only Hungary and Czechoslovakia emerged as major slip-ups. It has become less revolutionary. For example, it has discouraged what they call Castro's adventurism in Latin America. Its middle-aged status has already meant a tacit change in their commitment to the international communist movement. They probably will continue in the same path, which will mean some subtle changes domestically and internationally. And the Chinese will be the first ones to tell them that they have gotten into this middle-aged rut, which the Chinese call a return to bourgeois capitalism. Now, these are only a few reasons why we can look for some changes in the Soviet Union in this decade. The first thing I think you ought to look for will be some changes in leadership within this decade. Power, sometime in this decade, will pass to men presently in their late 40s and early 50s. Not all at one time, perhaps, but gradually. Of the men presently well known, some of the leading candidates are Dmitry Polyansky on the Politburo, Alexander Shalypin, the head of the unions, also in the Politburo, and a young man who came out of nowhere a couple of years ago and is now very important in the Secretariat, Katushin. He's in his 40s. He's the youngest. Most of the men at the top are over 60. They will die, retire, or be forced out. What will be the nature of the new leadership? Probably a continuation of technocrats in power. There will probably be few of what are called politician generalists at the top. Most of the men who are presently rising up are people who went to school as engineers or other technical fields, and then when they got jobs combined engineering with party work and gradually went fully into government or party administration, and then they went up to the top. There are few people who have what you might call a general background going up to the top today. Now, here perhaps I'm showing my liberal arts prejudices, but it is generally believed that people thus trained, technocrats, tend to be less creative than generalists when they are in power. And so perhaps the leadership will be less creative. Khrushchev was a good example of the politician generalist. And whatever else you want to say about Khrushchev, one must say he was creative. I've always said that Khrushchev's greatest strength was perhaps the fact that he never really understood Marxism-Leninism, with the result that he could be very creative in making ideological changes and then saying to the ideologist, well, I want to change this. Now it's your problem to figure it out. Unfortunately, Brezhnev and Kosygin went to good communist schools, and they learned Marxism-Leninism from third grade on, and they know it pretty well, and so they, in some ways, are less flexible. I also think you should look for some changes in the economy. Either a more intensive systematic application of the 1965 economic reforms, or an abandonment of them altogether, or an adoption of some kind of new economic forms, or some kind of modification. But look for some change there. Agriculture will remain the key problem of the 1970s, and how to solve it still has not been resolved. In intellectual life, I think that underground ferment will continue. The leadership may give up on its attempts to crush this and may permit freer expression, or conversely may become more repressive. In the next few weeks, watch what happens to Solzhenitsyn. It might be an interesting. More emphasis, I think, on consumer goods will continue in the 70s and probably be enhanced, primarily because of popular demand. And this is perhaps one of the areas where it is least hard to satisfy popular demands, in that you don't have to give up a great deal of principle or ideology. They want to have more consumer goods. They just haven't been able to do it so far. I think there will also be in the 70s even more of a recognition that classes will be around for a while, and that therefore the transition to full communism, the second and final stage, will be described in even vaguer terms, or perhaps not mentioned at all. And when you think that the present target for full communism would be when the Chinese reach the level, well, of very high development, you have a long way to begin with. Seventh thing, I would say that unless some severe turnabout occurs, the Soviet Union in the 1970s will be thought of less and less as the greatest communist country, and more as the great power, or as a great power. The communist factor, I think, will play less and less a role in foreign policy. We will see more high-level agreements, such as the SALT talks, such as the test ban, the nuclear nonproliferation, and so on, as well as more trade and cultural interaction with the West and other non-communist countries. The Sino-Soviet rift, I don't think, will be healed while the Maoists are in power. Too many insults have been exchanged, and I think they cannot really retreat from this while Mao is still in power. The Soviet Union will in some ways become a conservative power, since the status quo in the world is increasingly agreeable to her. Now, all this does not mean that the Soviet Union will be a passive power, nor does it mean that the Soviet Union will necessarily avoid confrontations with the West or with the United States. The USSR as a great power would probably be the rival of the United States, regardless who's in power there and who's in power here, what system they have and what system we have. I think this is a fact of life. Great power confrontations, therefore, still may be on the horizon, as well as high-level agreements. As a great power, I think the USSR will continue to see the United Nations as a forum for gathering influence and for presenting one's point of view. Insofar as the great powers agree, they will be able to utilize the potential of the UN for world peace and for other economic development and so on. Functioning of the Charter of the UN makes it almost impossible for the UN to do anything significant unless the great powers agree, and this has been the problem. In total, I would say the Soviet Union of the 1970s will be an exciting society to watch. The opportunity is ripe for them to make many changes, and the kinds of choices made will determine their futures. Unlike Amalric, I don't think the present system is doomed, but it might be if it makes the wrong choices. At the same time, I do not see the rapid democratization of the system. It will remain an oligarchy ruled by the party for the foreseeable future, but one can only hope that it will become a more liberal oligarchy. Thank you.
That was Professor Norma Noonan, chairman of the Department of Political Science at Augsburg College, speaking about Soviet intentions in the 1970s. Professor Noonan spoke in Minneapolis in late October at a rally in celebration of the 25th anniversary of the United Nations. Next Friday at 1:30, we'll present a third address from that UN rally. At that time, you can hear Eugenie Anderson, former U.S. ambassador to Denmark and representative to the UN Trusteeship Council, speak about prospects for Middle Eastern peace in the 1970s. The afternoon concert follows at 2:30 this afternoon. This afternoon, music from the 1969 Bergen Festival. Until then, we'll listen to music. We hear the Variations in D major for mandolin and harpsichord by Ludwig van Beethoven. It will be performed by Elfriede Kunschak, mandolin, and Maria Hinterleitner, harpsichord.